No missile was fired, no shot was heard. But a beam of light crossed a line that navies don't cross casually. A U.S. Navy helicopter is suddenly illuminated by a high-energy laser. In that moment, the aircraft isn't just flying, it's being measured. What followed lasted minutes, but was prepared for years. The helicopter was not on a combat mission. A U.S. Navy MH-60 Seahawk lifted into humid maritime air under a routine operational tasking, surveillance, presence, and verification. These flights happen every day across the Indo-Pacific. They are deliberately visible, deliberately lawful, and deliberately boring. That predictability is the point. It signals stability. Below, the sea was calm. Above, the airspace was uncontested. On paper, nothing about this flight justified tension. Then the cockpit lit up. Not with alarms, not with missile warnings, but with a sudden unnatural glare, concentrated, coherent, and directional. A laser. Not scattered light, not reflection. A beam with intent. For the aircrew, the distinction mattered instantly. Modern naval aviation treats laser illumination as a pre-hostile act. It sits in the narrow band between observation and attack, a space designed for deniability. A laser can range a target, test tracking stability, probe sensor vulnerability, or deliberately degrade pilot vision. It is silent, precise, and reversible, which makes it dangerous. The Seahawk's crew did not need confirmation to understand what was happening. The angle of incidence, the persistence, and the wavelength profile told a story before any command was spoken. Someone below was not watching. They were engaging. The likely source was a PLA Navy surface combatant operating in the same maritime corridor, a destroyer or frigate equipped with laser dazzling or ranging systems increasingly observed in Chinese naval doctrine. These systems are not advertised as weapons. They are described as safety or navigation aids. In reality, they are tools of pressure. The beam did not burn through the cockpit. That was never the intent. What it did instead was test the boundary. Would the aircraft maneuver? Would it abort the mission? Would it escalate the encounter? Every second the laser remained fixed, data accumulated on crew response time, aircraft stability, sensor resilience, and command discipline. This was not harassment. It was measurement. Inside the helicopter, procedures shifted without panic. Pilots adjusted heading and altitude to break the beam geometry. Sensor operators cross-checked warning indicators. Communications remained controlled. No distress call, no immediate broadcast. Because escalation is not triggered by fear, it is triggered by confirmation. And confirmation was already forming elsewhere. Surface radars, airborne ISR platforms, and fleet command nodes were correlating the event in near real time. Laser origin vectors are detectable. Patterns repeat. What looks like an isolated beam in the cockpit becomes a mapped act across the battle space. Still, no response was visible. No radio challenge, no fighter launch, no naval maneuver. That silence was not hesitation, it was discipline. Because the first phase of modern conflict is not about reaction, it's about documentation. By the time the Seahawk exited the engagement envelope, the incident was already archived, analyzed, and contextualized. The laser had switched off. The ship below returned to normal posture, but the encounter had already crossed its real threshold. Not the risk of damage, but the establishment of intent. And in modern naval warfare, intent is the most dangerous signal of all. The beam that struck the helicopter occupied a deliberate gray zone. It was not a missile seeker, not radar illumination, not a weapons lock in the traditional sense. It was a laser, a tool engineered to apply pressure without triggering doctrine. Modern naval lasers fall into categories that sound harmless on paper: range finders, target designators, optical dazzlers. They are officially described as non-lethal, reversible, and defensive. But their real value is strategic ambiguity. A laser can cross into hostile behavior without crossing into open war. That is precisely why they are used. At lower power levels, lasers can dazzle pilots, flooding night vision systems, saturating optical sensors, and disrupting depth perception. At higher intensities, they can permanently damage imaging equipment or human eyesight. The transition between those states is measured in milliseconds and operator restraint, which means intent matters more than capability. In this incident, the beam's stability and dwell time suggested deliberate tracking, not accidental sweep. This wasn't a deckhand mishandling equipment. It was an operator holding a solution. Chinese naval doctrine has increasingly emphasized non-kinetic control, shaping encounters without firing a shot. Lasers fit that doctrine perfectly. They generate reaction, collect data, and impose cost without creating wreckage or headlines. And crucially, they exploit a legal vacuum. International maritime law is explicit about gunfire and missiles. It is vague about light. Lasers do not leave fragments. They do not detonate. They can be switched off instantly. This allows the aggressor to claim safety checks, signaling, or coincidence, even when the beam is coherent, sustained, and aimed at a cockpit. That ambiguity is not accidental. From a tactical perspective, lasers serve three core functions in these encounters. First, ranging, measuring distance, angle, and stability against an airborne target. This data improves future engagements and calibrates fire control systems. Second, probing, testing how an aircraft reacts. Does it evade? Does it abort? Does it escalate? Each response reveals rules of engagement and command tolerance. Third, conditioning, normalizing harassment so that repeated exposure dulls reaction over time. None of these require destruction. In fact, destruction would defeat the purpose. A shot missile forces response. A laser invites hesitation. For the U.S. Navy, that creates a dilemma. Respond too aggressively, and the encounter becomes a propaganda victory. Respond too passively, and the behavior becomes precedent. So doctrine has evolved. Laser illumination is now treated as a hostile indicator, even if it doesn't meet the formal definition of attack. It triggers recording, correlation, and quiet positioning of assets. The response is rarely visible, because visibility escalates. What made this incident dangerous was not the beam itself. It was the demonstration that a weaponized sensor had been brought into the engagement space, intentionally, deliberately, and without apology. The laser wasn't meant to blind the helicopter. It was meant to ask a question. How close can we come? Before you decide this is war. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. The helicopter maintained altitude. Its profile remained steady. There was no abrupt breakaway, no aggressive turn, no visible distress. To an observer on the surface, the aircraft looked disciplined, almost indifferent. Inside the cockpit, the experience was very different. The first cue was visual. A sudden, unnatural intensity in the forward field of view. Too focused to be glare, too persistent to be reflection. Almost immediately, laser warning indicators began to register anomalous optical input. These systems are designed to detect coherent light patterns that do not occur naturally in maritime flight. The crew didn't need confirmation to know the risk. Lasers are uniquely dangerous to helicopter crews because of proximity and exposure time. Unlike fast-moving jets, a rotorcraft operates lower, slower, and often in predictable orbits. That makes it easier to track, and easier to hold a beam on target long enough to cause harm. The most immediate threat wasn't structural damage. It was vision. Even momentary laser exposure can overwhelm night vision systems, wash out sensor displays, and induce temporary flash blindness. At the wrong angle, it can also damage optical components, FLIR turrets, navigation cameras, or targeting sensors that cost millions and are mission-critical. The pilots responded with muscle memory, not drama. Heading was adjusted to disrupt the laser's geometry. Minor altitude changes altered the reflection angle. The goal wasn't to flee, it was to deny the beam stability. At the same time, sensor operators monitored optical systems for degradation, documenting wavelength behavior and dwell time. Every movement was measured. Because overreaction is data too. Inside the cockpit, communications stayed short and procedural. No raised voices, no expletives, no speculation. The crew load pre-briefed responses for non-kinetic hostile illumination, a category that now sits quietly alongside missile warnings and radar locks in modern naval training. What makes this moment uniquely stressful is uncertainty. A missile launch is binary, a laser is psychological. The crew had to assume intent without confirmation. Was this a range-finding pulse, a dazzler, a higher energy system being restrained or tested? There is no warning shot with light. The line between harassment and injury is invisible. And yet, the helicopter stayed in control. Because behind the cockpit, doctrine was already working. The aircraft was not alone. Data from the laser event, angles, intensity fluctuations, response times, was being logged and transmitted through secure networks. Other platforms were listening. The encounter was expanding beyond the cockpit into the fleet's awareness. The helicopter did not challenge the source. It did not illuminate back. It did not escalate. It endured. That endurance was not passivity. It was professionalism, the kind built to survive ambiguity without surrendering authority. By the time the beam ceased, the crew had already done what mattered most. They had denied the laser its psychological objective. No panic, no error, no visible weakness, just another flight on the surface. But for the men and women inside the cockpit, the encounter reinforced a hard truth of modern warfare. The most dangerous battles aren't fought with explosions. They're fought inside the human nervous system. While the helicopter crew managed the threat in the air, the real response unfolded far beyond the cockpit, silent, layered, and deliberately invisible. The moment the laser was detected, it stopped being an isolated incident. Across the battle space, sensor fusion systems began correlating the event. The helicopter's optical warnings were time-stamped and cross-referenced with surface radar tracks, electronic support measures, and satellite cues. What appeared to be a narrow beam in the cockpit quickly became a three-dimensional vector mapped across the sea. Laser emissions are not anonymous. Even low-power systems leak signatures, wavelength characteristics, pulse behavior, stabilization patterns. These fingerprints allow analysts to narrow down the source platform, narrow the equipment type, and assess whether the system was manually operated or integrated into a broader fire control architecture. In parallel, naval assets adjusted posture, subtly. Surface combatants shifted sensor focus without changing formation. Electronic surveillance platforms widened their collection windows. Subsurface assets already in the area repositioned quietly, not to threaten, but to listen. No wakes, no radio traffic, no visible signal that anything had changed. This is modern escalation control. The U.S. Navy does not respond to gray zone actions with equal gray zone theatrics. It responds with dominance through awareness. The objective is not to win the moment. It is to own the narrative space in which future moments unfold. Rules of engagement matter here. A laser does not justify immediate kinetic response, but it does justify preparation. Command authorities begin asking questions not heard on open channels. Is this behavior isolated or doctrinal? Is the emitting platform acting independently or under tasking? What else is operating in the vicinity? Unseen, unsaid? The answers shape options long before any order is given. Crucially, no warning was issued. That silence was intentional. Radio challenges escalate encounters by forcing public positions. Instead, the response remained internal, a calculated refusal to grant the laser its desired effect. Acknowledgement. Behind the scenes, however, the message was clear. The emitting ship had been identified. Its behavior had been recorded. Its position was now tracked with far greater interest. In modern naval confrontations, visibility cuts both ways. By illuminating the helicopter, the opposing force revealed more than it gained. It confirmed capability, posture, and willingness to operate in the gray. In exchange, it invited sustained scrutiny, the kind that follows a platform long after the encounter ends. No jets launched, no weapons armed, no movement betrayed intent, and that restraint was not weakness. It was confidence. Because when you can see the entire board, you don't rush the next move. You wait. And in that waiting, the balance of power quietly shifts. Not toward the ship with the laser, but toward the fleet that never needed to show its hand at all. Nothing about the encounter looked dramatic. No missile plumes, no warning flares, no emergency broadcasts crackling across open frequencies. And yet, by modern military standards, this incident came uncomfortably close to the edge of war. Because lasers are rehearsal weapons. They are used to practice escalation without consequences, to test reactions, validate procedures, and probe thresholds. When a military deliberately illuminates another nation's aircraft with a directed energy system, it is not improvising. It is sampling the future. What made this encounter dangerous was not the risk of immediate damage. It was the risk of misinterpretation. Had the beam lingered a few seconds longer, had it struck a different sensor, had a pilot suffered temporary blindness during a maneuver, the chain reaction would have been automatic. A safety incident becomes a hostile act. A hostile act triggers defensive posture. Defensive posture invites counter posture. And suddenly, two professional militaries are climbing an escalation ladder neither publicly intended to mount. This is why laser incidents are taken so seriously inside defense circles. They compress decision timelines. There is no visible launch to confirm intent. There is no explosion to justify restraint. Everything hinges on judgment under uncertainty. Strategically, the message was unmistakable. China demonstrated a willingness to bring non-kinetic weapons into close operational contact, signaling confidence, testing resolve, and shaping future encounters. The United States demonstrated something equally important: discipline. By not escalating, the U.S. Navy denied the incident the very thing gray zone tactics seek: reaction. Instead, it preserved optionality. Every response remained reversible. Every asset remained uncommitted. That asymmetry matters, because wars don't begin when weapons fire. They begin when options disappear. In this case, no options were lost. The helicopter completed its mission. The fleet maintained posture. The encounter ended without headlines or damage. But the data did not vanish. It moved into doctrine, training scenarios, and operational planning. It will inform future patrols, future rules of engagement, and future responses on both sides. That is why this was a near-war incident. Not because it almost exploded, but because it quietly advanced the battlefield into a new domain. A domain where light replaces gunfire, where sensors replace sabers, where the first move is invisible and the most decisive. And in that world, dominance belongs not to the side that acts first, but to the side that understands exactly when not to.